Hello, my name is Dr. Andrew Willcocks. I'm the Director of International Trade and Partnerships with Mundi, the search engine for international law and arbitration. So firstly, let me take you through what this 20-minute presentation will cover. And I want to make sure that we understand where we're going, we understand how we're going and what we're going to cover. As an outset, I will share this screen and so you'll see my face pop up from time to time as we go through this little overview. And when I say it's a little overview, those in the industry who are aware of free trade agreements and preferential trade agreements, as they're called, and rules of origin, you will understand how complex this topic can get. So without further ado, I will move to sharing my screen and we will go from there. So excuse me for the other content, and I'll take you across. And I'll just share this part of my screen with you. Okay, so scrolling across, what we can see is what this presentation will cover. I want to bring your attention to the note at the bottom of the screen. I really want to be very clear about this. This presentation is not to be taken by observers as legal advice or customs advice. And please always obtain independent legal advice or consult with a customs broker in your jurisdiction. I can't stress that enough. So this presentation is an academic overview only, and I would like to make it absolutely clear that I would like you to consult independent legal advice or a customs broker if you have any questions about your own products or your own trade, whether you're importing or exporting. So I think it's worthwhile going through what we can all read on the screen there, which is firstly what the presentation will cover. So the importance of open access to information about international law. And I will have a slide attached to each of these that you'll see as we go through. The second element is goods trade and preferential treatment of goods. So where to look in a free trade agreement for the rules of origin chapters. So the third slide, and interlinked with the second, is examples of free trade agreement texts and rules of origin chapters. And then lastly, we get through to the importance of independent legal advice, independent advice from customs brokers or your legal advisor, because qualifying for preferential treatment under a free trade agreement is unique to your goods. Now, if none of that made sense to you at all, that's okay. Hopefully we will be able to skim across some of the complexity of this very complex topic as we go forward. So firstly, I'll just return, I'll stop sharing my screen as we go, and we'll just return to me being on the screen there. So firstly, I want to discuss the importance of being able to have access to treaty materials and how important that is from the point of view of importers and exporters of goods. Now, as we all know, free trade agreements or trade treaties, preferential trade agreements, they are meant to be WTO plus, so they are in addition to the benefits that WTO rules provide under MFN trade and other trade systems. So always when we think of a free trade agreement, we need to remember that it's really it's an instrument that sits on top or as complementary to the WTO and the trading system that dates back to 2003 and has been updated with the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement and other instruments as we've gone on. I won't go into that here, but it's very important to make sure that everybody has in their minds as the foundation, as the base for engaging in goods trade at least, we see that the WTO is that foundation stone, and your free trade agreement or preferential trade agreement adds to your benefits on top of the WTO. The second thing I want to really say and make absolutely clear is that free trade agreements are often thought by the public to be automatic. Certainly when we hear in the media that a free trade agreement has been signed, So you hear about many free trade agreements. I won't go into specifics because we'll go into that later on in the presentation. But many trade agreements have been signed, and the public, by and large, believes that there's just free movement of goods back and forward with no checks or balances as we go forward. Now, that's the general public. I'm speaking to an audience of likely experts, some of whom will be very expert at rules of origin. Others of you will not be across the material as much. But we all know that actually to get the advantage for goods trade out of a free trade agreement, treaty, your goods need to comply with the preferential treatment chapters of that treaty. And those chapters are called the rules of origin. And certainly there are many experts, many places you can find that sort of information about rules of origin, indeed compliance for goods trade under a free trade agreement. And that's why throughout the presentation I will be reminding you to always seek independent legal advice and the advice of the customs broker if needed. It is often a good place to start with understanding the broad aspects of information from a business point of view, particularly in relation to goods trade. I do want to make a side note as I'm going, which is that free trade agreements also contain investment chapters, they contain chapters on telecommunications, they contain environmental chapters, many of them. These are big treaties, and they allow parties to the treaties, so party economies to the treaties, to engage in further work that perhaps isn't going to happen otherwise at the WTO while things are negotiated at the WTO. And it enables better interaction, particularly around technology, for party economies to the treaty. So what we're focusing on particularly, though, is goods trade as a beneficiary under a free trade agreement treaty instrument. So without further ado, I'll go back to our slides there and we'll have a quick look at what we're going to talk about next. So here we go. Okay, thank you for bearing with me. So remembering this is the first of our 4 sections, so we're going into the first bit. So really, what is it about the open access to information about international law that's really, really important? Well, the first point to note is that preferential or free trade agreements are designed to benefit goods trade in economies party to the agreement. Now, when you think about the kind of companies, both importing and exporting in economies that are party to a free trade agreement, you often think about some of the major producers or major manufacturers, moving parts, particularly goods like vehicles, complex products, advanced manufacturing, big products. But we also need to remember that a lot of goods trade occurs for small businesses that might only have 2 or 3 employees. And I think that's where we really need to focus on, because as we all know, anyone attending this conference will know that small businesses are the powerhouse of any economy in the world. Certainly the more comprehensive exporters and importers and producers of goods will be well versed in perhaps how their products can take advantage of different trade treaties or different trade arrangements. But it's the small business exporters and importers that I want to focus on particularly. And that's why this overview is very, very broad and general. Okay, so as we discussed before, the benefits under a free trade agreement or a preferential trade agreement, as they're known, is not automatically applied to goods trade. So if you're the importer, the goods you are importing must qualify for preferential treatment under an FTA treaty. If you're an exporter, the goods you are exporting under that FTA treaty, if you want to qualify for the preferential treatment, should also qualify. And what do I mean when I say they should qualify to benefit for preferential treatment? essentially to remove tariffs that are applied at the importing side when you have an FTA overlapping the jurisdictions of the countries involved of the parties involved in the trade. Sorry. So it's really, I often explain it to people in terms of you remove a tax on the goods when they arrive at their destination, if there's a free trade agreement applying to those goods. But it doesn't happen automatically. You need to actually apply to show that your goods qualify. So that's why we have this sentence here: importer or exporter may be required to prove the goods qualify depending on the free trade agreement. And as many of us in this conference know, there are many ways to prove origin of goods. And some of those include certificates of origin issued by chambers of commerce. Some of them include self-declaration by the importer or the exporter. It really does depend on the text of the FTA. And in a roundabout way, what I'm trying to bring you towards is the concept that it really is the access to information that will determine how easy it is for businesses that may not have access to many tools at their disposal or an entire body of staff to work this complicated stuff out. Instead, it is actually about accessing the information and having the confidence that you can research that information properly. And I think you can see what I'm getting at when you see the bottom of this slide. So FTA treaty texts are often fragmented with overlapping jurisdictions, and they're hard to obtain. Sometimes they come in PDF documents that are just scanned and it's difficult to read them. Other times governments will host the texts in a way that is very accessible, but it differs from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And that's why Mundi makes freely available 30,000 documents in international law, including free trade agreements or preferential trade agreements. And I will just duck over, but I'll duck over to Mundi and show you. I'll switch to Mundi and show you later in the slides. But I'll just stop sharing my screen a minute and just recap that first section that we just covered. So essentially, if small businesses don't have access to understanding what they need to do for their goods to qualify under a free trade agreement, then what we have is a large chunk of each economy that happens to do a free trade agreement with other economies missing out on the benefits that are provided by the free trade agreement drafters, whom are governments. And our governments do this to benefit business. And so not only do we want benefits for the large corporate players who certainly do shift a lot of trade around the globe, but we want the benefit for those smaller exporters and importers. So I'll just go back to sharing my screen and we will go across. And thank you for bearing with me. We'll go across to the second slide. So the question is, okay, well, where do we look in a free trade agreement? Now, anybody who's had anything to do with rules of origin or exporting or importing under rules of origin in a preferential trade agreement will know exactly what I'm talking about. So apologies for the pedestrian nature of what I'm explaining, but it does bear explaining. So in each FTA, a free trade agreement tends to be a standardized or largely, you could predict what chapters would exist in a free trade agreement. Often there's an investment chapter if you're talking about investor-state dispute settlement or investment controls on binding on the investors or on government's behaviour towards investors. I won't be touching that in this presentation. But also in most free trade agreements, nearly all of them, you will find a chapter called the Rules of Origin. So this is a misleading name, and because it's not just the rules of origin, so it's not just about the rules of the origin of the goods you're wanting to export or import, it's actually about also the methods of qualifying. And what do I mean by that? The methods of qualifying are often about, do I need a certificate of origin to show this? Who do I get the certificate of origin from? Do I do a self-declaration? What's my liability if I do a self-declaration? Do I do no self-declaration at all, but importing customs has the right to come back and ask me maybe 5 years later for the paperwork to prove the origin of the goods? And when you're talking about shipments that might be worth millions of US dollars, a 5 or 10% tariff reduction ends up looking like a lot of money. So you want to make sure you get it right. Hence my statement in this presentation that I really want people to always consult a customs broker in your jurisdiction or your independent legal advisor in your jurisdiction. But if you're looking for that initial step of trying to work out, does this apply to my goods, and maybe I should ask my independent legal advisor about it, or should I ask my customs broker about it? Well, first you need to find the treaty, and you need to work out, does it apply to my jurisdiction or economy? And that involves finding the treaty text and finding the chapter on rules of origin. And I will make a little side note there as well, which is that I recommend that people who are doing a sort of overview and exploring this, whether their goods that they're importing or they're wanting to export might qualify under a free trade agreement that covers their economy and the one that they're importing or exporting to. There's also often guides by government authorities in either the importing or exporting jurisdiction. Sometimes these guides are extremely helpful. Other times they are simply one sheet of paper and some language on it that you really can't understand. So it really depends on where your government is and where your government is up to with providing particularly small businesses with the detailed explanations that they need. So I'll just move on to the next slide because these two are interlinked. So the next slide really shows us what we've got in terms of certain types of free trade agreements or examples of this. So as we can see, the chapters on rules of origin, it's not just the rules but the method of qualifying. And we'll click on this link first here. This will take us through to Mundi. You can get this these free trade agreements. Of course, you type in the acronym for a free trade agreement. Notice I'm not logged in. You can just get the linear texts here. I won't go through this too much, but they're all available online and free. If you want to use our more comprehensive tools in that search engine, then you do have to subscribe, and I invite you to take a free trial. But also I just want to really come back into what we're discussing, which is, let's have a look at this table of contents. Here's the layout of the free trade agreement. Of course, you can see customs procedures, sanitary, phytosanitary measures, and it's this chapter 3 on rules of origin that I really want to examine. And so what we can do is on this one, I might actually go into the PDF just to give you the visual. So we just scroll through. There's chapter 2. We just keep scrolling through, and normally we wouldn't do a manual scroll through, but I just want to show you for visual sake how it looks. So here's our chapter 3, rules of origin. Unsurprisingly, rules of origin chapter. So it gives you the definitions of what particular terms of art mean inside the treaty, inside the rules of origin chapter. And then this article 2, you'll often see this or versions of this. And this is really quite important, okay? So in just a minute, I'll try and explain to you how this works. So wholly produced or obtained. So if a good you're exporting or trying to import from an economy and the exported good is wholly produced or obtained in a party. I often like to say that it's either grown there or dug up there and isn't transformed in any way. Things like carrots or animals that have only grown up in the economy, inside the economy that's affected. So that's examples of wholly produced or obtained. And we can actually, if we just jump down, here's that exact description: goods obtained from live animals born and raised, minerals extracted, and so on. But I'll just come back up here. So if it's not any of those things, so if it's not grown or extracted from the actual economy, or the geography of the economy, I should say, then it's not wholly produced or obtained, but the good satisfies the other articles. Or, and this is the third one, this is a bit tricky, it's produced in a party of the free trade agreement, so one of the economies of the free trade agreement, exclusively from originating materials. So perhaps it's carrots from the other economy party to the FTA and your own economy, and that's produced entirely within a party. And I'll just duck across again because we're running short of time. The not wholly produced or obtained is the definitions are down here as to what you can do. So Article 4, goods not wholly produced and obtained. And this is where you really do need your customs broker to assist you or your legal advisor to assist you, because you can calculate according to regional value content, you can calculate according to operations or processes on the goods, or you can calculate on the value added in terms of the direct formula, indirect build down formula. These are very complex concepts that won't be discussed here, but I just want to show you where you can look for them in a given free trade agreement. Very, very quickly, let's go across and have a quick look at the other one, which is the RCEP, Rules of Origin chapter. Let's open that PDF and have a quick look. Oh, look, here you go. Great example. Rules of Origin. Chapter 3, Rules of Origin, same sort of thing. So you can start to look there and you at least can start to get your head around the overview of what you might be expecting to see in a free trade agreement to determine whether your products comply. And again, just for visual purpose, normally we wouldn't scroll down like this, we'd use the search feature. But Rules of Origin, here it is again, definitions, look familiar. And again, this is a totally different free trade agreement. Originating goods, does this look familiar? This is exactly what I just described before. Okay, so wholly obtained, so grown, carrots, that sort of thing. Produced in a party exclusively, so carrots from the economies that are party to the treaty, let's say, or produced in a party using non-originating materials, and then these requirements are set out at Annex 3A. So you then have to go to Annex 3A. And if I want to do that, look at that, there's Annex 3, specific commitments, and so on. So you can go through and find those, and this probably is one of the more recent ones. I won't waste our time too much longer, but of course I'll let you explore this yourselves for the same reason, and of course multiple languages available up here. Anyway, enough of that. So again, just recapping that, wholly obtained or produced goods, or goods produced entirely from inside the FTA parties, or the very complicated change in tariff classification, value added or specific processing mechanisms, for which I recommend you use a legal advisor or customs broker. Many of you watching this will be legal advisors or customs brokers yourselves. Again, I just want to briefly touch on the importance of independent advice. So qualifying is unique to your goods, the goods being exported and imported. Okay, the permutations are obviously endless. Think about a cake containing almonds from the USA, dates from Mexico, flour from Germany, salt from the USA, butter from New Zealand. Thinking about all the ingredients that go into making a product really does involve thinking about what method or mechanism for qualifying for preferential treatment applies. And again, there are other things that also your customs broker, or your legal advisor can go through with you, which includes harmonised system codes applying to your goods, sanitary, phytosanitary requirements, other import or export requirements or restrictions based on what the good actually is. Again, and I need to stop so that we can take some questions. Recapping this overview, and I apologise for how quickly this very complicated subject is covered. We've looked at the importance of open access to information about international law, including free trade agreements and related treaties. We've also looked at goods trade and preferential treatment, where to look in a free trade agreement. Chapter 3, it's not always Chapter 3, but you look for the Rules of Origin chapter in a free trade agreement to start to understand maybe if you're able to comply. We then, through usemundi.com, we had a look at those free trade agreement texts and the Rules of Origin chapters. And often they follow the same pattern, but often the rules are slightly different per chapter. Again, that's why point number 4, the importance of independent advice. Qualifying is unique to your goods, and as a result of that, it is very important to seek independent legal advice. So this presentation is, of course, not to be taken as legal advice or customs advice either, and of course, you are encouraged to obtain your own advice. I'll leave it there, but thank you very much, and I look forward to taking your questions. Thank you.